Hi, everyone. Before the episode begins, I just want to remind you to follow me on Instagram and Facebook at Marlene the Plant Lady and YouTube, Everything Gardening with Marlene Simon. And remember, please, please, please rate and review on iTunes and Spotify. That just helps the podcast get noticed by more people, and then more people will become better gardeners. And that's what we all want. So enjoy the episode.
Look at that plant. I want you to know that everything was grown in my garden. Don't touch that plant!
Is it poisonous?
She'll become part of the plant.
Hey everyone, welcome to Flower Power Garden Hour. I'm your host Marlene, and this is your March to Do episode along with question and answer. And Joe is not with me. Joe is recovering from a really bad sinus infection that started from the flu, and I did not get sick. I've not been sick in 6 to 7 years. I was around over 2,000 people and around Joe, and I still can't get sick. Am I tempting fate? Yes, I am, but this is strange. So it's just going to be me because Joe would just cough the whole entire time. So I'm going to go through what to do in your garden in March, and I have a few questions that I will read to you and then, basically give you the answers. But it has been an exceptionally cold season for us. The snowpack is insane up in the mountains, and we're still getting rain, which is great. But is that affecting how much I've been out in the garden? Yes, it has been. But right now in March, there are still some things. And remember, I'm coming at this from zone 9. If you're in a different zone, do double check to see what your to-do list is because it is going to vary. This is zone 9. And right now in March, you could still plant broccoli plants. So, plant away. You could plant beet seeds, cabbage plants, cauliflower plants, chives, collards, Swiss chard, which pretty much you can plant almost year round, kale, loose leaf lettuce, potatoes, and radish. So yes, you could start your potatoes. You could buy seed potatoes, or you could even go and buy organically grown potatoes and plant them whole or cut them up and let them sprout and then plant them, ideally organic, so they're not treated with any chemicals that prohibit growth coming out. And so, yeah, you could do potatoes now. You could start your tomato, eggplant, and pepper seeds inside. Remember, peppers are planted later than your tomatoes, which should only be planted outside in the ground when soil temperatures and night temperatures hit about 50 degrees. And we're pretty far away from that. Generally, end of April is the earliest time. You could start sowing some annual flowers like zinnias. And in March, it's time to sow sunflowers. And remember, you don't want to work really wet soil. So if the soil is incredibly boggy and wet, do let it dry out a bit. But these seeds you could start inside or outside. So any annual flowers that are summer blooming, you could start sowing now. Dahlias in summer bulbs. So no, you can't plant, daffodils, even though I found some hyacinth bulbs when I planted them and they're starting to sprout. We'll see. But dahlias and summer bulbs like gladiolas, you could plant in the ground now. You could still prune your roses, even though they are budding out, and March is still allowed. Pretty much plant everything. We still have frost, so you do want to avoid planting really frost-sensitive plants, but everything that's perennial, by the end of March, you definitely should be able to plant your frost-sensitive plants like citrus and avocado. Check your irrigation. Even though we have a lot of rain, as soon as we get a dry spell, temperatures are going to increase, soils are going to dry out, and you might start having to irrigate. I'm not saying you're going to need to. Always dig down to check your soil moisture. But there's nothing worse than having to irrigate and then having irrigation problems. So just, run your irrigation, see if you have any, especially that drip line through the winter. Animals could chew on it and things could break. Transplant actively growing plants that are either in pots or you want to move around the ground. When they're actively growing, starting to bud, you've heard me mention that the hormones responsible for root formation are taking hold, so your transplanting is going to be a little bit better. We're starting to transplant a lot of our potted plants that are outside at the conservatory as they start breaking dormancy is a good time. You could cut back your dying foliage of your winter, early spring blooming bulbs like daffodils, but remember, let the foliage die all the way down. That is the energy source to those bulbs. So you want them to die down. And of course, just constant cleanup. Adding compost. I've been adding compost and mulch, trying to add stuff to the soil, feed the soil, of course. Weed control is always an issue. So really it's spring fever's taking hold a little bit. As soon as we have some of those sunny days, I'm like, oh, I need to go to the nursery and start buying plants, but I'm also cutting things back that are showing new growth, and I'm removing the old growth for them. And yeah, it's spring, or it will be spring very soon. So now I have some questions for you. And one of them was about roses. Hey, I was told that you could trim your roses December and or January before the budding starts, which is interesting because I got this question not that long ago. But yeah, so the ideal time to really prune your roses is January sort of through March. The key is, though, is you could prune them pretty much any time. You do just want to avoid when it's really wet because those wounds are open. And if you have a really wet weather, it's sort of an access point to standing water and bacteria. So I would say no later than March should you be pruning them. I've pruned my roses. Remember, year round, always prune the rootstock coming up. I've also not pruned my roses every year. I've sometimes been like, I'm lazy. I have too many roses. I'm going to do every other year. And it's fine. It is good to remove the dead. It's good to thin out the center. And of course, controlling the height. Sometimes they could get very large. So I would say January through March is the best time. If you do it in December, it's okay. It's not horrible. Just remember the dry is best. Another question. Good afternoon, plant lady. I have a couple questions. When would be the best time to start planting tomatoes? And is it better to plant tomatoes in the ground or in a 5-gallon bucket? I've seemed to have better results on cherry tomatoes when I put them in a bucket. And when I plant on my tomatoes, what other vegetables may I plant? But maybe jalapenos, bell peppers? Please let me know. Thomas. All right. It probably has to do with your soil. Is why possibly they do better in a 5-gallon bucket. Now, I always say that the smallest container I would ever grow a tomato in is a half wine barrel, just because they do get huge and you want a lot of root space. 5-gallon bucket, if it's working for you, hey, the only thing with that is, of course, you have to have a drainage hole. The other thing is it's pretty small. And if you have it in full sun, some of the heat could burn those roots that are along the side. So you may even have a smaller root system. But certain cherry tomatoes don't really care. They're very prolific. But if you have heavy, heavy clay soil or rocky soil, of course, in a bucket with better controlled like potting soil is going to be better. So I would say it depends on your soil, but I would say, if you're hearing this and you're like, oh, I want to do that, I would do half wine barrel. 5-gallon buckets working for you. That's great. But I would go with, a little bit bigger pot. Between a pot and in ground, it's really not much of a difference, but I will say clay soils sometimes work to your benefit because in-ground soils with clay work to your benefit because you have to water less. Anytime you bring in potting soil, it's made to be faster draining and you're probably going to have to water more. And you never want to take the native clay soil and put it in a container. It just does not work very well for growing plants. And yeah, other vegetables you can plant in, jalapenos, peppers do great in a 5-gallon because peppers for the most part stay smaller than tomatoes. So they do great in a 5-gallon. Don't put them in the same 5-gallon pepper. But remember, start your peppers later, like May, than you would your tomatoes because they love the heat. All right. Is it too late to plant bulbs? Are there any varieties that could be planted in late February/March, Stephanie? Yeah. So like I mentioned, it's too late for the most part for some of your, your daffodils and your tulips because those are planted in the fall. But yes, February, really March is another round for your summer blooming bulbs. And those are going to be more specifically Dahlias and gladiolas. Those are just hands down. March is the time to plant them. But other things, canna lilies. There's one called Ursinia, I think I'm pronouncing that, or sea onion. It's the biggest bulb there is. It's not very showy. It's a perennial. Tuberose, caladiums could be planted in March as well. So yes, there is another round of bulbs, but they're not your quote standard ones, not crocus, tulips, daffodils, hyacinths. Those should have all been planted in the fall. Let's do one more question here. I have had 2 African violets plants for a year. They dropped their blooms a long time ago and have not rebloomed. I water them from the bottom each week to 10 days, and I use African violet liquid plant food with the watering. They do get sunlight. They seem healthy otherwise. Any ideas for how to get them to bloom? Thank you, Glenda. In my experience with growing a lot of African violets is sun, sun, sun. Even though they do get sunlight, it's the intensity of the sunlight. I had like 30 to 50 right up against a south-facing exposure, and the windows. It was a strange condo where the windows went from basically down to the ground to the equivalent of a 3rd floor, and it was all facing south. And I had my African violets close to the window as possible. I had some leaf burn, but I always had them in bloom. So they require more sunlight than people are aware. And yeah, you could bottom water them. That's fine as long as the whole entire root ball is getting moist. So do dig down and check, because you don't want that to sort of stop only like, a quarter way up. African violet liquid is fine every time you water. That is okay. It depends on the strength you use. I tend to fertilize mine every time I water, because it's more diluted than versus, I'm only fertilizing once a month. You're going to use a heavier strength. So yeah, if they look fine or healthy otherwise, then obviously the moisture is fine. The fertilizing is fine. Another way you could tell if they're getting not as much sunlight to maybe trigger some blooms is if they're very flat. Obviously that is the classic African violet look. But if they're not blooming, they're very flat, then that means they could be in slightly lower light. If you can't move them to a window, there are those cheap LED strip lights. That's what I have my African violets growing in. And you can put them pretty close, the lights, to the African violet, because the LEDs don't put off as much heat as other lights, like fluorescent lights. So if you can't have a window you can move them to, you could get a grow light. But also, watch the sun as it's transitioning, because right now, maybe it's not a highlight area, but as the sun transitions, it might be a very bright. So right now, they might be in a spot where, they're just not getting as much light, and you may not need to do anything. But the fact that they haven't been blooming for 2 years, no, you said you had 2 African violets, so I'm not sure how long you've had them. So really, if you bought them last summer and then the sun transitioned and they haven't bloomed, wait and see if they'll bloom again in the summer. Then okay, the spot is okay if I get blooms twice a year, because this is when the sun's intense. I want more blooms. I'm going to put a grow light in. I love African violets, so I say keep going at it. Keep going at it with them. But there you go. So those are some questions. Those are some of your to-dos for May. Hopefully, I love the rain. We need the rain, but to get into the garden, to plant, you want that soil to dry out a bit. But of course, there's always add compost, always buy your seeds, start sowing seeds inside, always weeding, and start cutting things back. And of course, always buying plants. That's always 100%. You could just always buy house plants, any plants, doesn't matter. I'm from your husband. Joe's not here, so he doesn't hear me saying that. But until next time, everyone, happy gardening.